It was said afterward, by everyone who had stood close enough to see it done, that the Duke of Rowanmere had gone 4 years without fastening a single jewel about his wife's throat, and that he chose at last to fasten one about another woman's instead. The ballroom at Ashwell House had been dressed for a betrothal that was not his own. His cousin's, a girl of 19 with more hope than sense, and the candles had burned low and gold by the time the dancing thinned and the older guests gathered near the long windows to watch the young people spin. Cecilia, Duchess of Rowanmere, stood a little apart from them, as she generally did, her hands folded before her in the particular stillness she had cultivated since the first year of her marriage, when she had learned that a woman who did not fidget was a woman whom the room eventually forgot to examine. She wore blue that night, a plain deep blue without ornament, because the one ornament she owned that she truly loved, 3 strands of pearls, small and unfashionably yellowed with age, that had belonged to her mother and to her mother's mother before that, sat, as it always did on evenings such as this, in the top drawer of her dressing table, wrapped in a handkerchief that still, faintly, smelled of her mother's hands. She had not seen her husband take them from that drawer. She would learn later that he had sent his valet for them that afternoon, with instructions so brief the man had not thought to question them, and that the valet had assumed, reasonably enough, that her Grace herself had asked for them to be pressed and cleaned. No one in that house had thought to ask the Duchess anything at all. It was, Cecilia would reflect afterward, the truest description of her marriage that she had yet encountered. She saw them before she understood what she was seeing. A low gleam at her throat across the room, half hidden by the crush of guests, and some old animal instinct in her went very quiet and very cold before her mind had caught up enough to name the reason. Lady Sophia Vane stood near the card-room door in ivory silk, laughing at something a colonel had said, one gloved hand resting at her collarbone in the unconscious way of a woman checking that a compliment has truly landed there, and there, warm against her skin, catching the candlelight in small yellowed gleams that Cecilia would have known blind, in the dark by touch alone, were her mother's pearls. The Duke stood just behind Lady Vane's shoulder. He had evidently only just finished the clasp. Cecilia did not cry out. She did not in fact do anything that the room could afterward describe with any certainty at all, which was its own kind of scandal in a world that expected its wounded women to perform their wounds. She watched her husband step back from Lady Sophia Vane's throat with the pearls settled and bright upon it, watched Lady Vane's hand rise to touch them, watched the small private smile pass between the two of them that belonged, unmistakably, to 2 people who had once known each other very well, and had never entirely stopped. Then she turned, found Simmons at the edge of the room with the particular unerring instinct old servants have for locating disaster, and said, "Only my cloak, if you please." She did not seek her husband out to make her exit known to him. She had long since stopped expecting him to notice her comings before her goings. It was the Duke who came to her, cutting across the ballroom floor with the particular controlled haste of a man who has felt, too late, the ground shift beneath a decision he made without weighing it, Lady Vane's laughter and the pearls both forgotten behind him. Cecilia. He had not used her given name in company in longer than either of them could easily have said. A word. "I find I have said all the words I have tonight, Your Grace." Her voice was even. It was, she would think later, the evenness that undid him more than any accusation could have, the plain, unhurried courtesy of a woman speaking to a stranger. "They are only pearls." They are my mother's pearls. She let that sit between them exactly as long as it needed to. She died wearing a plainer stone than that necklace and left me nothing else worth calling an inheritance. I do not expect you to have known that, since you have never asked. But you might have asked before you sent Davies for them. He opened his mouth to explain, she supposed, some scheme involving Lord Vane's parliamentary votes and his brother's contested inheritance, some perfectly reasonable architecture of duty and necessity that she would, in a calmer week, have been capable of hearing out. She did not give him the calmer week. She drew off her wedding ring, a plain gold band, unremarkable beside the diamond that sat above it, which she left, and pressed it into his gloved hand, closing his fingers over it herself, gently, the way one closes the fingers of someone who has not yet understood that they are meant to be holding something. I find I no longer require this either, she said, if my rings, like my pearls, are also only mine until you have better use for them, and left him standing in the candlelight with his hand closed around a ring that had, until that moment, felt entirely permanent. By the following morning the story had travelled every mews and backstair between Ashwell House and Grosvenor Square, embellished at each telling until footmen 2 streets away were describing tears that had never been shed and a scene that had never quite happened as it was told. Rowanmere House itself, however, held a stranger, quieter aftermath than any of the servants' gossip suggested. The Duchess's room stood empty by 10 o'clock. Her maid, Betson, was found packing a single modest trunk with the efficient economy of a woman who had clearly been given instructions the night before and had simply waited for daylight to carry them out. The Duke learned of his wife's departure from his butler, which was, in its own way, a fitting continuation of the previous evening's education. Her Grace has gone to Larkspur, Your Grace, Simmons informed him, in the carefully neutral tone he had perfected over 11 years of service in that house, a tone that managed to convey a full paragraph of private opinion while stating only a single fact. The cottage that came to her from her mother's side, she left before 8. Alone? With Betson and Mrs. Pruitt, Your Grace. I understand, Mrs. Pruitt has been urging her Grace to make use of the property for some time. A pause, waited. I believe her Grace found this morning a convenient occasion to finally take the advice. The Duke did not go after her that day, nor the next, and told himself, with the particular stubbornness of proud men, that this was restraint rather than cowardice, that a woman who had left in such evident deliberation deserved the dignity of being allowed her exit rather than chased down like a runaway parcel. It did not occur to him, not yet, that there was a difference between respecting a woman's departure and simply being relieved not to have to account for himself in front of her. He went instead to his study, where Henry found him an hour later. Henry, his brother Edmund's boy, 8 years old, and orphaned onto Rowanmere's guardianship 18 months previous, a solemn child who had inherited his father's habit of asking exactly the question no one else in the room was willing to voice. Simmons says Aunt Cecilia has gone away, Henry said from the doorway, in the flat factual tone children use when they have decided that adults' evasions are beneath serious consideration. He says you gave her pearls to Lady Vane. It is not so simple as that, Henry. Simmons says it is exactly so simple as that. Henry considered this. Was Lady Vane's neck cold? The Duke, despite everything, felt the corner of his mouth attempt a smile it did not deserve. I could not say. Because if her neck was not cold, I do not understand why she needed Aunt Cecilia's pearls. Henry weighed this with visible seriousness, the seriousness of a boy for whom logic had not yet learned to bend itself around adult convenience. Aunt Cecilia let me hold them once. She said they were the only thing of her mother's she had left, because her mother died when the ship came in wrong, before Aunt Cecilia's father could pay the physician in time. And there was no money then for keeping things, only the pearls, because they had already been given to her when she was small. He looked at his uncle with the plain, unbearable directness of the very young. "Did you know that, Uncle Julian?" The Duke discovered that he had not known it, not the ship, not the physician, not the 4 years of his own marriage during which his wife's history had sat, entirely unexamined, in a drawer he had never once opened himself. He said nothing to Henry that satisfied either of them, and the boy went away disappointed, and the Duke sat a long while in his study with his brother's son's question, turning slowly into something considerably heavier than a question. Larkspur Cottage sat 2 days' hard travel north of London, on 11 acres of neglected orchard and rough pasture that Cecilia's mother had brought to her own marriage and that had passed, by a quiet clause in a will nobody had thought much about at the time, directly to Cecilia rather than through her father's estate. She had visited it perhaps 6 times in her life, always briefly, always as a girl too young to notice that the drainage ditches along the northern boundary had not been cleared in a decade, or that the orchard wanted pruning so badly that half its trees had stopped fruiting from sheer neglect. She noticed all of it now, arriving in the flat grey light of an April morning with a trunk, a maid, and a companion who had known her since she was 6 years old and had never once, in all that time, told her anything she did not need to hear. "It wants a great deal of work," Mrs. Pruitt observed, surveying the cottage's sagging front gate with the resigned satisfaction of a woman who had privately expected exactly this. "Good," Cecilia said, and meant it more than she could easily have explained. There was, she was discovering, a particular relief in problems that could be solved with a ledger and a spade rather than with patience and silence. Problems that responded to effort in a way that 4 years of marriage had never once responded to hers. She spent the first fortnight learning the land the way she had once, briefly. Learned her father's counting house before her marriage had made such learning unnecessary, and then, in the same stroke, unwelcome, walking every boundary herself with the old estate map spread flat against a fence post. Asking the 2 remaining tenant families blunt, specific questions about yield and rent and the state of the drainage that most gentlewomen of her rank would not have thought to. Ask, and writing everything down in a plain green ledger she had bought from the village stationer for 4 pence. It was in pursuit of the drainage question, a boggy strip along the northern boundary that flooded every tenant's lower field by February, that she first met Mr. Aldous Fenner, the widower who held the neighbouring land. Standing on his own side of the disputed ditch, with an expression of a man bracing for an argument he had clearly had before with previous owners of Larkspur. "You'll be the new Mrs. Drayton," he said before she had introduced herself, in the flat tone of a man who had already decided the conversation would go badly. "Her Grace, technically," Cecilia said, "though I confess I have not much use for the technicality out here, and would rather you called me Mrs. Drayton than stood on ceremony over a ditch." She watched something in his shoulders ease slightly. "I understand the boundary drain has been a point of contention with Larkspur's owners before me. 3 owners running now. Your late grandmother would not clear her half. The tenant who held it after would not pay to clear it either, and blamed my side for the flooding instead of his own neglect. Fenner regarded her with the wary respect of a practical man, assessing whether another person was in fact also practical, or merely pretending to be for the length of a single conversation. You've walked it yourself, I take it, rather than sending an agent. I find agents describe land they have not troubled to look at very closely. She unfolded the estate map again, indicating the relevant stretch with one gloved finger. I should like to split the clearing cost evenly and be done arguing about whose fault the flooding was, if that is agreeable to you. I have no interest in fighting a battle my grandmother started and did not have the sense to finish. Fenner studied her for a long moment, not unkindly, but with the particular attention of a man recalibrating an assumption. That, he said finally, is the first sensible offer either side of this ditch has made in 9 years, and put out his hand to shake on it, man to man, in a way that no one in 4 years of Cecilia's marriage had ever once thought to do. There were evenings, in that first fortnight at Larkspur, when the ledger work was done and the light had gone from the window, and Cecilia found she had no further practical task to hide inside. And on those evenings she permitted herself, briefly and only briefly, to examine the 4 years she had just walked away from with the same unsparing thoroughness she had brought to the estate map. She had married at 21, knowing precisely what the marriage was for, her father's alliance secured, the Duke's debts settled, a title exchanged for a fortune in the plain, unsentimental arithmetic that governs such things among families like theirs, and she had told herself, in the carriage on the way to her wedding, that she was fortunate to be marrying a man who was at least not cruel, at least not a drunkard, at least civil in the narrow, correct way that passed in her new world for kindness. She had not asked for love. She had told herself quite firmly that she did not require it, and had spent 4 years proving the claim so thoroughly to herself and to everyone watching that she had very nearly stopped noticing the proving had cost her something. It was only now, with the pearls gone and the ring off her hand, that she allowed herself to name what the 4 years had actually been. Not cruelty, precisely, but a long, unbroken absence. A marriage conducted the way one might tend a property one had inherited but never troubled to walk, signed for, maintained at a distance, occasionally admired from a window, and never once actually entered. She wrote of none of this to anyone, not even to Mrs. Pruitt, who would have listened without judgment and said nothing useful in return, because Mrs. Pruitt's gift had always been silence rather than counsel. But she did receive in the 2nd week a letter from Lady Augusta Drayton, whom she had met perhaps a dozen times in 4 years of marriage and had liked cautiously on each occasion, without ever quite trusting that the liking was returned. My dear Cecilia, the letter began, without preamble or apology, in a hand as decisive as its author. I will not insult you by pretending I write only out of general concern for your welfare, though I do feel it. I write because I have said certain things to my nephew this week that I believe were true and necessary, and because I think you are owed the knowledge that they were said, whether or not they bear any fruit. He is not, whatever the ballroom suggested, a cruel man. He is a frightened one, which is a different failing and I think a more curable one, though I understand entirely if 4 years have exhausted your patience for waiting to see whether it is cured. I do not ask you to wait. I ask only that if he comes to you, and I believe, in time, he will, you judge what he brings you by whether it is honest, rather than by whether it is sufficient. Honesty, in my experience of the men in this family, generally arrives well before sufficiency does, and a woman who insists on both at once may wait considerably longer than she ought. Cecilia read the letter twice, and then set it in the same drawer where she had begun keeping her green ledger's completed pages, and did not answer it that week, though she found, in the days that followed, that she thought of it often, not because it changed her mind about anything, but because it was the first honest thing anyone in her husband's family had troubled to say to her since her wedding, and she had not realized until she received it how starved she had been for exactly that plain a courtesy. She mentioned none of this to Fenner when he came the following week to report that the clearing crew had begun work on the northern ditch, though he noticed, with the same practical attentiveness he brought to drainage, that she seemed lighter that afternoon than she had on their first meeting, and was tactful enough, being a man who had buried a wife of his own and understood something of grief's slow arithmetic, not to remark on it. In town, meanwhile, the scandal had settled into the particular shape scandals took when no one involved would confirm or deny anything outright, which was to say it grew, fed by its own silence, until half of Mayfair believed the Duke had installed Lady Vane at Rowanmere House outright, and the other half believed the Duchess had fled to the arms of some unnamed lover of her own. Lady Sophia Vane, for her part, did nothing to discourage either version. She wore the pearls twice more that week, to the opera and to Lady Hetherington's card evening, with the particular deliberate carelessness of a woman who understood exactly what she was advertising, and had decided, after 11 years of a marriage she had not wanted to a man twice her age for money her own family had needed badly enough to sell her for it, that she had earned the right to a little advertising. It was his aunt who finally said to the Duke what no one else in his household had dared to. Lady Augusta Drayton had buried a husband, outlived 2 brothers, and raised her nephew's motherless boy for 18 months without once complaining of the inconvenience of it, and she had accordingly earned, in the Duke's estimation, the right to say almost anything to him that she pleased. She exercised that right on the 5th evening after the ball, arriving at Rowanmere House unannounced, and finding her nephew exactly where she had expected to find him, alone in his study, a letter to Larkspur begun, and abandoned 3 times over on the desk before him. "You have not sent it," she observed, without preamble, seating herself across from him uninvited. "I have not known what to say." "Then say what is true," which is generally the easiest thing to say once a person stops looking for a version of the truth that also flatters him. She regarded her nephew for a moment with the particular unsparing fondness of a woman who had known him since he was Henry's age and had watched him build, brick by careful brick after his father's death and his own broken engagement to Sophia Fenwick, as she had been, before her family's debts had made a title impossible and a fortune necessary, a version of himself that felt nothing publicly, because feeling publicly had cost him Sophia once, and he had decided at 19 never to be made a fool of by his own heart again. "You did not give that girl your wife's pearls because you love her, Julian. You gave them to her because giving her something, anything, in front of a room full of people who remember exactly what you lost when her family sold her to Lord Vane, felt like proving something to a version of yourself that stopped mattering 15 years ago. That is not," he stopped. Started again, more honestly. "I do not know that it is untrue. It is not untrue. Augusta's voice gentled marginally. "But you have been married 4 years to a woman who has never once, to my knowledge, asked you for anything. Not affection, not attention, not even the courtesy of being consulted about her own jewelry, and you repaid that extraordinary restraint by handing her single inheritance to the one woman in London best positioned to humiliate her with it. Whatever this was about, Julian, it was never about Sophia Vane. It was about a wound you have been nursing since before Cecilia Hartley's father ever paid your debts, and you let it cost your wife something she cannot get back, because her mother is dead and cannot make more pearls." The Duke sat with that for a long time after his aunt had gone, and when he finally took up his pen again, the letter he wrote was shorter than any of the three he had abandoned, and considerably more honest, and he tore that one up as well, because he had begun to understand, dimly, that a letter was not going to be sufficient for what he had done. He did not go to Larkspur himself, not yet. Pride, even wounded and newly examined pride, does not dissolve in a single evening's honest conversation. But he did not forbid Henry's request to visit either, when the boy came to him a week later with the particular transparent cunning of a child who has clearly rehearsed his argument. "Aunt Augusta says I may go if you permit it," Henry announced. "She says Aunt Cecilia would like to see me, because I am the only person in this house who was ever entirely kind to her, which she says is a very low standard for a household to have failed to meet, and that she hopes you are ashamed. Your Aunt Augusta says a great many things. She says most of them are true, though." Henry considered his uncle with the frank assessment of a boy deciding how far he could push an advantage. "May I go?" The Duke sent him with Mrs. Pruitt's sister, who travelled to Larkspur regularly enough that the arrangement raised no particular remark, and spent the 3 days of Henry's absence in a state of unproductive restlessness he did not care to examine too closely. Henry returned with mud on both knees, a jar of his own honey harvested from Larkspur's single beehive, which he presented to his uncle with visible pride, and a great deal to report, delivered over supper with the thoroughness of a boy who understood he had been sent, in some unspoken capacity, as an envoy. "She has a ledger," he said, "a green one, and she lets me help add the columns, though I am not very fast yet. Mr. Fenner came twice while I was there, about a ditch, and Aunt Cecilia gave him tea both times, and they argued about drainage for a whole hour, and it was the dullest conversation I have ever heard. But she looked happier arguing about the ditch than I have ever seen her look at any of our parties. He ate a mouthful of soup, considering I asked her if she missed you." The Duke set down his spoon. "And what did she say?" "She said that missing someone and wanting to see them were not always the same thing, and that I was too young to understand the difference, which I thought was rather unfair, because I understand a great many things." Henry frowned at his soup. "She still wears her wedding ring, though, the little plain one. Not on her hand, on a ribbon under her collar, where I only saw it because she leaned over the ledger and it slipped out. I do not think she knows I saw. It was, the Duke would think later, the single most important sentence his nephew had ever spoken to him, and it undid the last of whatever careful, self-protective distance he had been maintaining since the ballroom. All at once, entirely, he went to Lady Vane the following afternoon. Not at an evening party where an audience might mistake the visit for exactly the kind of scene society had already half invented, but at her own house, at an hour calculated to be neither intimate nor concealed, and he did not sit down when he was shown in. "I have come for the pearls, Sophia." She looked at him for a long moment, with an expression that held, underneath its practiced amusement, something more complicated and considerably older. The particular grief of a woman watching a door she had spent a fortnight quietly propping open finally, decisively, close. You gave them to me in front of 400 people. I gave them to you because I was a coward who wanted to feel, for one evening, like the man I might have been if your family had not needed my title's money more than they needed your happiness, and mine had not needed your fortune more than it needed anyone's honesty. That is not a reason. It is barely an explanation. He held out his hand, palm up, in a gesture that cost him considerably more composure than it appeared to. They were never mine to give. They belong to a woman who has never once, in 4 years, asked me for anything, and I have decided I am done taking things from her because she is too dignified to make a scene about the taking. Sophia was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally reached up to unclasp the pearls herself, her hands were entirely steady, which the Duke understood, watching her, to be its own kind of composure, the same composure. He realized with the discomfort of a man recognizing an unwelcome resemblance that his wife had shown him in that same ballroom a fortnight before. I did not do it only for you, you know, Sophia said, placing the pearls in his open palm with a care that surprised him. I did it because I am 34 years old and widowed to a man I never chose, and for one evening I wanted to remember what it felt like to be chosen by someone, even second-hand, even briefly, even knowing it was cruel to the person the choosing had been stolen from. That is not an excuse either, but it is true, and I find I am tired of not saying true things. She managed finally something that approached her old smile, thinner and more honest than any expression the Duke had seen her wear in 15 years. Go home to your Duchess, Julian, or wherever it is she has gone. I understand Fenner's land marches with a very pretty cottage, and country squires have been known to notice pretty, capable widows before now. It was not kindness, precisely, in the way it was delivered. There was too much old hurt still threaded through it for that. But it was, the Duke thought, walking out of her house with his wife's pearls wrapped carefully in his handkerchief, the truest thing Sophia Vane had said to him in a decade. And it put considerably more urgency into his step than pride alone would have managed. He arrived at Larkspur 2 days later, unannounced, in travelling clothes still marked with the road, and found his wife exactly where Henry's report had promised she would be, in the small side room she had made into an office, bent over the green ledger, with her sleeves pushed back, and ink on 2 fingers of her right hand, a lamp lit against the early evening despite the season's lengthening daylight, its glow visible from the lane before he had even reached the gate. She did not look surprised to see him, which he understood, once he had considered it, to be its own quiet indictment that his arrival, however unexpected, could not compete for astonishment with everything that had preceded it. Your Grace. She set down her pen with the same unhurried composure she had used to hand him back her ring. I did not expect the road from town to have improved so much that you could manage it in 2 days. I did not stop to sleep the second night. He remained standing just inside the doorway, aware suddenly of every year of careful, feeling nothing composure he had built since he was 19 and had felt entirely too much, standing between himself and whatever he had actually come to say. He drew the handkerchief from his coat and set it, unopened, on the corner of her desk. These are yours. They have always been yours. I am sorry it took me a fortnight and my own aunt's considerably more patient temper than I deserve to understand that giving them away was not a careless mistake I can explain around. It was the truest evidence I could have offered you of exactly how little I had bothered to know you in 4 years of being married to you. Cecilia did not reach for the handkerchief immediately. Why did you do it, Julian? It was the first time in 4 years she had used his given name without an audience to perform composure for, and he felt the absence of formality between them like a held breath finally released. He told her then, plainly and without the excuses he had spent a fortnight discarding one by one Sophia, the broken engagement, the debts that had made his marriage to her a necessity before it had ever had the chance to become anything else. The particular cowardice of a man who had decided at 19 that never being made a fool of again was worth more than ever being known again, and had built a marriage, without quite meaning to, on the same careful distance. I did not ask about the ship, or the physician, or your mother, because I had trained myself for 15 years not to ask anyone anything that might matter. It was not about Sophia. It was never really about Sophia. It was about a version of myself I have been protecting since before I knew you existed, and I let protecting him cost you the one thing you had left of your own mother. I married you for reasons that were not entirely different from your own, Cecilia said quietly, after a silence that held rather than accused. My father needed the alliance as badly as your family needed the money, and I told myself, at 21 that a marriage built on two families' convenience might still, given enough time and enough patience, grow into something warmer, the way a garden grows warmer toward a wall that has been standing long enough to hold the day's heat. I have spent 4 years being patient. I do not know that I have 4 more years of patience left in me, Julian, even now, even with the pearls returned. She looked at him directly, the lamp between them throwing long shadows across the ledger's neat green columns. I am not certain composure and hope are the same thing, and I find I am tired of not being able to tell the two apart. I am not here to ask you to be patient again, the Duke said. I am here because Henry told me you keep your ring on a ribbon under your collar rather than on your hand, and I have spent 2 days on the road understanding that I would rather earn the right to see it back on your hand than spend 1 more year assuming I already had. He drew a chair opposite hers, not presuming to sit until she gave some small permission with her eyes, and when she did, he sat, and set his own hands flat on the desk between them, in plain view, the way a man sets down cards he does not intend to bluff with. I do not have a grand speech, Cecilia. I have spent a fortnight discovering that I am considerably better suited to grand speeches than to the small, ordinary attentiveness a marriage actually requires, and I do not trust myself tonight to offer you anything I have not already tested against something practical. So I will tell you what I have arranged instead, and you may judge from that whether it is worth your patience. He counted it out, plainly, the way Henry might have added a column of figures. I have written to my solicitor to have Larkspur's deed confirmed entirely in your name, unencumbered by my estate, so that it is never again a thing I could claim any authority over. I have asked Fenner, who, I understand, thinks a great deal more sensibly of drainage than I have ever thought of anything, to recommend an agent for the northern boundary, since I gather that dispute has outlasted 3 owners and I should like it settled before it outlasts a 4th, and I have told Simmons that when we return to town, If we return to town, her Grace's ledgers travel with her, and any steward who questions her figures without first checking them against his own may find employment elsewhere. Something in Cecilia's carefully held composure loosened, very slightly, at that last detail. Not the deed, not the solicitor, but the small absurd specificity of the steward. You spoke to Simmons about my ledgers. I spoke to Simmons about a great many things I ought to have asked you myself years ago. He was remarkably patient with my ignorance, for a man who has clearly held an opinion of me for some time. The Duke's mouth found, unexpectedly, something close to a real smile. I am asking you to come home, Cecilia, not because a Duchess is expected to, and not because I require an heir the parish will not gossip about, though I will not pretend those considerations do not exist somewhere in the world we live in. I am asking because I would like, very much, to learn the difference between the wife I assumed I had married and the woman who taught herself to run 11 acres and mediate a drainage dispute in a fortnight without asking anyone's permission to do either. I do not deserve an immediate answer. I would only ask that you not give me a final one tonight. Out of fatigue or fairness or whatever kindness you are still unaccountably extending me. Cecilia was quiet long enough that the lamp between them guttered once and steadied. I will come home, she said finally, but not tomorrow, and not because you have asked prettily, which you have not, and I find I am glad of that, since I would not have trusted it. I have promised Fenner I will see the northern ditch cleared before the summer rains, and I intend to keep that promise before I keep any other. You may write to me in the meantime, if you like plainly, the way you have spoken tonight, and not the way you spoke to me across a ballroom for 4 years. I will judge the marriage by the letters before I judge it by anything grander you might be tempted to arrange. She reached, at last, for the handkerchief on the desk's corner and unwrapped it, and looked for a long moment at the pearls inside before closing her hand around them. And Julian, the ring stays on the ribbon until I choose to move it. Not tonight, not because you have asked. Because I choose it, and I find after 4 years that I am no longer willing to hand my choices to anyone, even you, out of mere hope that it might be easier. That, the Duke said, seems an entirely fair account to keep. He wrote to her every week through that summer, plainly, as she had asked, filling his letters with the sort of ordinary particulars he had never once thought to share with her in 4 years under the same roof. Henry's slow progress with his sums, a tenant dispute at the London property he had, for the first time, consulted his steward's ledgers to resolve, rather than simply approving whatever figure was placed before him. The small private discovery that he had inherited his father's dislike of asparagus, and had never known it until Cecilia's absence left him eating alone often enough to notice his own preferences at all. Her replies came back steadier than his, full of the ditch's progress, Fenner's grudging admiration once the drainage was finally cleared, and both their lower fields ran dry for the first summer in a decade, and, toward August, a small unremarkable postscript that the ribbon had in fact come off some weeks previous, though she did not say when or explain further, and he did not ask. She returned to town in September, in her own time and by her own arrangement, and the Duke did not meet her at the door with any speech prepared, having learned enough that summer to distrust his own eloquence in favour of showing up, plainly, and letting the showing up be the argument. The formal reconciliation, when society finally witnessed it, was smaller and stranger than the scandal that had preceded it, Not a grand ball, but a modest family dinner at Rowanmere House to mark Henry's 9th birthday, to which Lady Augusta had, with characteristic decisiveness, invited perhaps 30 of the most notorious gossips in London, on the theory that a quiet demonstration would do more good than any public denial could manage. It was there, over the second course, that the Duke rose, without any announcement beforehand, and crossed to where his wife sat, and asked, in a voice pitched to carry to precisely the tables it needed to carry to, and no further, whether she would permit him to fasten a necklace for her. Cecilia's hand went, briefly, to the plain string of pearls already at her own throat, worn openly for the first time since the ballroom, without ribbon or concealment, and something passed between them that the assembled gossips would spend a full fortnight failing to adequately describe to those who had not been present. She inclined her head once and turned in her chair, and the Duke's hands were not entirely steady as he worked the small clasp, which Simmons, watching from the doorway with the particular satisfaction of a man who has waited 11 years to see a household set right, would later describe to the kitchen staff as the first time he had ever seen His Grace's composure genuinely fail him in company, and the finest thing he had witnessed in service. Lady Sophia Vane was not present that evening, having accepted, some weeks before, an invitation to spend the autumn with a widowed cousin in Bath, a decision that arrived unprompted in a short note to Cecilia rather than to the Duke, a note that said, in its entirety, that she wished the Duchess joy of a marriage she had once nearly had for herself, and hoped that whatever the Duchess built of it would prove less lonely than the alternative Sophia had spent 15 years imagining instead. Cecilia kept the note, unremarked upon, in the same drawer that had once held only her mother's pearls, and never mentioned it to her husband at all, judging, correctly, that some kindnesses were better kept between the women who had actually extended them. Mr. Fenner, for his part, sent a wedding gift of sorts some months later, a small silver trowel, absurdly formal for its purpose, engraved along the handle with the words for the boundary, which arrived with no note attached and required none, and which Cecilia kept on her desk at Larkspur for the rest of her life. 3 years on, the pearls sat once more in a drawer, not from neglect this time, but because they had, by then, a new keeper. Their daughter, Margaret, not yet 2, had discovered a fondness for pulling at anything that gleamed, and Cecilia had taken to locking the strand away except on the particular evenings when she wanted it worn, which was increasingly whenever she pleased, and no longer only when duty required it of her. Larkspur remained hers, deeded and unencumbered exactly as the Duke had promised that first evening, and the family split its year between the cottage's 11 acres and the town house with a regularity that would have scandalized the ton of 4 years previous, and now simply amused it, since the Duke of Rowanmere had become, somewhat to his own surprise, rather better known among his peers for his opinions on drainage than for anything else about him. He had learned to read a ledger properly, under his wife's patient and occasionally unsparing instruction, and kept his own small green book now, tracking figures for the northern boundary land he had, at Cecilia's suggestion, purchased outright from Fenner's estate the previous spring, so that the disputed ditch belonged at last entirely and uncomplicatedly to no one's argument but their own shared one. Henry, 12 now and considerably less solemn than the boy who had once demanded to know whether Lady Vane's neck had been cold, spent his school holidays at Larkspur learning to add ledger columns properly at last, and had taken, that particular autumn, to teaching his small cousin Margaret her letters using the same green stationer's book his aunt had first bought for 4p, so that the ledger's later pages held, alongside careful columns of rent and yield, a scattering of a child's uneven capital letters practising her own name. On the evening of Margaret's 2nd birthday, the family gathered at Larkspur rather than in town, at Cecilia's request, and the Duke found himself, at dusk, standing at the cottage's front gate, the same sagging gate Mrs. Pruitt had once surveyed with such resigned satisfaction, long since repaired, watching the lamp in the side office window catch and hold against the falling light, exactly as it had on the evening he had arrived unannounced with a handkerchief full of pearls and considerably less certainty than he had needed. Cecilia found him there a few minutes later, Margaret asleep against her shoulder, and followed his gaze to the lit window without needing to ask what he was looking at. "I used to see that lamp from the lane," he said, "before I had earned the right to walk past the gate. I did not tell you that, I think." "I knew." She said it simply, without accusation, the way she said most things now. "I left it burning on purpose, some evenings, longer than the work required. I told myself it was for the ledger. It was not only for the ledger." She shifted Margaret's small weight against her shoulder and looked at her husband with an expression that held nothing left of the composed stillness she had once cultivated as protection. Only the plainer, harder one thing that had grown in its place. "Come inside, Julian. Supper is nearly ready, and Henry has promised Margaret he will teach her to write a P for pearls before he lets her go to bed, and I find I would rather watch that than stand at a gate remembering how long it once took you to walk through it." He went in with her, the lamp still burning behind them in the office window, and the boundary line that had once needed 9 years of quarrelling to settle now marked nothing more contentious than the edge of a garden 2 people had built, slowly and honestly, entirely together. The pearls stayed in the family after that, passed eventually to Margaret on her own wedding day, wrapped in the same handkerchief, still faintly bearing, or so Cecilia always insisted, the same trace of her mother's hands, and with them she passed on the only instruction that had ever mattered concerning them, that a thing given away carelessly could, if a person were patient and honest enough about the carelessness, be earned back entirely, but that no one, however dearly loved, was ever owed the earning back without first doing the plain, unglamorous work of understanding exactly what had been broken, and why, and at what cost to the woman who had stood, once, in a ballroom full of candlelight, and simply removed her ring, rather than pretend the breaking had not happened at all.